right, so for part 4, the final part of our first lesson, we're going to shift our focus from poetry to fiction. As I mentioned, poetry was the predominant form during the Romantic period, but fiction was still very important and influential. And we're going to look at one of the earliest fiction writers from the Romantic period and also a female, Maria Edgeworth. I know this first lesson is incredibly long. That's because there was so much background to cover with the syllabus, the introduction to the Romantic period, and the notes on how to interpret poetry. Going forward, they'll be much shorter than this. Edgeworth is great, and this is a lovely story, so I do want to spend some time on it, but I am going to try to wrap up as quickly as possible for you. Her most famous work is called Castle Rackrent, which is a great novel. You should read it sometime if you have time. We're taking a look at her short story. It's a great one, The Irish Incognito. So Edgeworth's literary career helped make the novel a respectable art form. In this sense, she anticipates Sir Walter Scott and Jane Austen. Excuse me. So what you should know is before the Romantic period, novels were not very popular. Only a few had been written, and poetry and drama were considered the high quality forms of art. There just weren't very many novels around yet. People hadn't written that many. The Victorian period is really when the novel becomes prominent and popular, so we'll start to talk about that in lesson 4. But I would argue that 4 writers before the Victorian period were really influential in the rise of the novel, and that would be Maria Edgeworth, Sir Walter Scott, Jane Austen, and Mary Shelley, going through those in chronological order. And so Edgeworth, of those 4, though, is the least famous, and I really think we should pay more attention to her because she does great work. People often call her the Irish Jane Austen. They had a lot in common. Like Jane Austen, she had a close relationship with her father and never married. She lived on a family estate in Ireland for the majority of her adult life with many half-brothers and half-sisters. Her father had 21 siblings in total from 3 marriages. But she lived on his estate once he invited her to live there while he was with his 3rd wife. And she lived there for her entire life. She even rejected a marriage proposal from a Swedish diplomat in 1802. So like Jane Austen, she rejected a marriage proposal, never married, and had a close relationship with her father, and most importantly, wrote some really great novels and stories that helped readers to see that the novel was just as good of an art form as poetry. Her father was a really interesting figure, and it sounds like a pretty brilliant but eccentric guy, and I think his influence was helpful to her becoming the great writer that she did. He considered their big family estate in Ireland basically a laboratory, and he came up with these innovative approaches to education, to agriculture, and he was very kind and treated his tenants well. But these were all new ideas, and he basically practiced them or experimented with them on this farm. And so he instilled in her, an idea of all people should be treated more equally, like his tenants. Other people just abuse their tenants on their estates. And also to keep learning, to keep growing. We see that through his innovations in education and agriculture. She wrote regional fiction, a representative of Ireland, so she focused on local Irish settings and concerns, but also on a more universal scale. She also transcends that Irish setting, as we talked about. She actually engaged with the social and economic philosophies of the Enlightenment. She's like Blake, she's an earlier writer. We're studying kind of the earliest romantics in this first lesson. And so her writings, when she was writing, the ideas of the Enlightenment were still prominent, and she engaged with those in her writing, and that helped people see, oh, the novel really can engage with these big ideas. And so by engaging with the big ideas of her time, she helped put the novel on the map as an important art form and help people see that it's not just poetry that's great, novels are good too. She also subtly critiqued the British oppression of Ireland. I'm not going to go into the colonial history of Britain and Ireland, but basically because I don't have time. I wish I could. If you've taken classes with me before, you'll know it. But basically, Britain treated Ireland like one of its colonies, and Britain was very oppressive in its rule of Ireland and forcibly incorporated Ireland into the United Kingdom. That's a quick summation of it. Um, but Edgeworth was a clever and subtle writer, and as you'll see in the story, The Irish Incognito, she was able to critique um, British oppression and British colonization of Ireland, but use these social economic theories of the Enlightenment to do so. So she was very subtle and popular as a writer, despite presenting these kind of revolutionary political views, because she was so deft and subtle and creative. All right, so here are some of the interesting threads I noticed while reading The Irish Incognito. One is nationalism and nationality. The protagonist is Phelim O'Mooney. That is such an Irish name, and he's from Cork, which is where the Blarney Stone is. It's probably the most famous Irish city after Dublin. So this is an Irish guy through and through. But then when he poses as a British person, he uses the name John Bull, which is actually a personification of England. John Bull is like Uncle Sam in the US, but in England. And so the Irish national identity and the English national identity are at the forefront of this story. Now, in terms of her critique of British oppression of Ireland, there's an important point here that is in the footnote on the first page of the story. So hopefully you read that footnote. If you didn't, I'm going to cover it now, but it's very important. And so this story was part of a collection of stories and essays Edgeworth wrote, and it was called An Essay on Irish Bulls, first edition 1802, second edition 1808. A bull is a verbal blunder, an expression containing a contradiction that goes unperceived by the speaker. So the speaker basically says something that makes them look dumb. Collecting Irish bulls was a tradition in England that basically they made fun of the Irish. They said, look at all these silly things the Irish do. So Edgeworth in this story uses that idea. Mooney is able to pose as a British gentleman. The only time he gets caught is when he makes an Irish bull. But he's able to pose as a British gentleman long enough to win the bet with his brother. And so even though she introduces the idea of Irish bulls to the story, it's actually a key idea to understanding the story. O'Mooney's mastery of posing as a British person and ability to avoid making these Irish bulls. He essentially masters the discourse the British use to make fun of the Irish. She's critiquing the British. She's subtly saying, yeah, the Irish may be dim-witted, but look at what we can do. We can actually outsmart you. But the average British person reading it might not pick up on that. They might think she's making fun of Irish people too, because it's very subtle. So this goes back to that historical context point about how she was able to stand up for the Irish while still being popular, even though that would be a radical view at the time. And this Bull's idea is really important to understanding the story. It's used in so many ways. The character is John Bull. She's also critiquing this tradition. We see it even more, which you'll see in one of the quotes later on. Another thing here is a critique of imperialism or even reverse imperialism. O'Mooney evokes the Romans colonizing Britain when he first arrives in Britain, and he's the Irishman going to England, but England has colonized Ireland. So imperialism is very important here. Here's some more. Mimicry is a term from post-colonial studies. Post-colonial studies is the study of colonization and how colonized people have responded, especially after the end of colonization. And there's a term from post-colonial studies called mimicry, which is where someone from the colonized country, in this case Ireland, is able to pose as someone from the colonizing country, in this case England. The blurring of national identities. This is important because we have this entity that is the United Kingdom, which includes England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. But it's a complicated identity because Ireland was, you could argue, forced into being part of the United Kingdom and isn't always treated as equal. Scotland, Wales, and Ireland are not usually treated as equal to England in this supposedly unified group, and Ireland is usually treated the worst. So when through his mimicry, when he goes back and forth between these identities, Mooney is able to show the ambiguity and the complexity surrounding the idea of the United Kingdom and point out to readers how it's not just one nice, happy family of countries. There's more to it. There's an interesting point about work ethic. Mooney does basically everything he can to avoid work, and that usually involves him being a trickster, kind of a con man. He pulls off the biggest con of all when he poses as an English gentleman throughout the story. And the bet is that if he loses the bet, he'll have to take up a trade and start working for a living. If he wins the bet, his brother will pay him 100 guineas. He wins the bet, gets the guineas, but still becomes a working man. And so his brother has actually made a point to him. Even though his brother loses the bet, he wins the argument, essentially, about the validity of work. And so this is actually a story that emphasizes the importance of work ethic. And that could come back to the Irish national identity as a theme, because many people in Ireland were part of the working class, and it was seen the working class was more of a part of the national identity in Ireland than it was in England. Although England obviously had a huge working class, the upper class were the predominant figures in the public characterization of British national identity. National pride. It's not just about identity, but pride, because O'Mooney, when he does make a bull, he just makes just the right amount of bulls and just barely gets out of this winning the bet. But every time he does this, because he's taking pride in Ireland, he's wanting to identify with being Irish. So Edgeworth is really wearing her Irish identity as a badge of honor in this story, but she's doing it subtly, which is important. Finally, cosmopolitanism. Mooney not only blurs these national boundaries, but he makes friends with English people and friends with Scottish people who, even after they know the truth about him, like him enough as a person, they consider him a friend, and vice versa. He's friends with them. And so the national boundaries really break down here, and true friendships are formed beyond national boundaries in this story, which is another reason why I think it's a great, fun, interesting story. All right, on to the close reading here. Just going to look at a couple of quotes from the story and explain them. So there's a quote here early on when he first arrives in England that says, he embarked at Cork to go by long sea to London and was driven into Deal, where Julius Caesar once landed before him, and with the same resolution to see and conquer. So I have a thesis here I've developed from this. So we looked at all those threads. Now I'm pulling on the threads by looking closer at the story and trying to form a claim. So here's my claim about imperialism. The Irish incognito displays reverse imperialism when its protagonist, Phelim O'Mooney, sails from Cork to Deal and evokes Julius Caesar, thus foreshadowing his eventual figurative colonization of Britain through his ability to master English manners and customs well enough to effectively pass as an English gentleman. So, reverse imperialism is a term in post-colonial studies where the colonized colonize the colonizers. They reverse the colonization. And the reverse colonization here is figurative. He doesn't actually colonize Britain, but he figuratively does that by mastering English well enough to pass as an Englishman and get what he wants from it to win a bet. And so that's what he figuratively does. And this moment in the story that's in the quote is emblematic of that, because he lands when he arrives. He sails from Cork, which is this most Irish of Irish cities. And when he lands in England, he lands in Deal, which is the English city where Julius Caesar landed when the Roman army invaded and conquered Britain in 55 BCE. So, hopefully that all makes sense, but you can see how, I go from this thread of an interesting idea. This story must have to do with colonization because it's Britain and Ireland, and then you have it happening in this story. And the quote supports that. So I could use this quote in a paragraph to prove my thesis if I were writing a paper on it. The other quote I wanted to look at is our hero, who was of a most happy temper, congratulated himself upon having, by his own wit and prudence, escaped making the practicable of marrying a female swindler. So I actually didn't finish the thesis here. I'm not sure what happened. It must be some kind of typo, and I apologize for that. But the two things I thought that were really interesting about this quote was, one, is he's taking the idea of a bowl and applying it more widely, not just using it as a way for the British to make fun of the Irish, but it's a very practical mistake. If he'd married this woman, he would have not only lost the bet, but lost whatever money he had, and he escaped that fate. So he's using the term bowl much more widely here, rather than just as a way for the British to make fun of the Irish. And then also, I think this might be, it doesn't really explain directly. The story doesn't explain directly why he chooses to become a working man after he wins the bet. But I think this instance might be one reason why, because he's almost caught by this female swindler. He almost is fooled by her and almost loses. So I think that kind of shows to him the dangers of the game he's playing, and also how the other people playing the game are not the best people. So I think this might be a key moment in his decision for the end of the story. But it doesn't say that directly. That's an argument I'd have to make. So I'm trying to illustrate here how we can develop a thesis and then try to support it with analyzing the text. So I'd have to find more quotes to prove this in a whole paper, but this would be a start to it. All right, one last slide. After coming up with some threads, reading the story more closely and trying to learn more about those threads, what have we learned? You just saw two examples on the last slide. I'd like to give you one more example. And with this final example, I'd like to provide an example of a cultural context reading. If you've looked at your critical analysis papers, I'm going to ask you to provide a cultural context section, which is a section of the paper where you talk about a trend or phenomenon, something happening at the time, and explain how that influenced what you're analyzing in your paper. And so I'm going to do that by tying together the last part of the lecture with this part of the lecture and look at how the slave trade could have influenced Edgeworth's story. So here's my thesis. In The Irish Incognito, Maria Edgeworth critiques the British slave trade that was prominent at the time she first composed the story, 1802, so before abolition, when she shows that all human beings have value through her Irish protagonist's ability to pass as an English gentleman and subsequently critique the English traditions that have oppressed the Irish. So what I'm doing here is arguing that her critique of British oppression, which hopefully is very clear now because I talked about it a lot, I'm arguing that that's a more general thing, that what she does in the story can be read to stand for oppression more generally, and because the slave trade was happening at the time, and she would have obviously known about it because everyone did, and she was very well read, then the story's more general critique of oppression in general can be read as a critique of the slave trade, and O'Mooney's passing for an Englishman as his ability to do that as an argument that all humans have value, that the British are not more important than the Irish. Similarly, the British are not more important or more valuable than the slaves that they keep. So what you would do, or I would do if we were arguing this in a paper, would be to provide a cultural context section where we would use primary sources. We're going to talk more about primary and secondary sources when we get closer to the due date of the paper. But primary sources are sources written at the same time as the literary text you're analyzing. Secondary sources are the critical articles written later on, the ones people are writing today. So you'd pick one, for an example of primary sources, you could pick one or several of the readings from the slave trade and the literature of abolition section of the textbook we just studied. and use them, paraphrase them, connect them to give readers an overview of the time. So you have an intro with a thesis about Edgeworth using the story to critique the slave trade. Then you have a paragraph where you use these primary sources to explain to readers exactly what was happening in the slave trade at the time. Finally, then you have the rest of the paper where you analyze the literature to prove your thesis. So I would then go through and show how O'Mooney critiques British oppression, or how Edgeworth critiques British oppression through O'Mooney, and how we can interpret that more generally to not just apply to the Irish, but to also apply to human beings more generally. Thus, in the context of the time, the story can be read as a critique of the slave trade. So it might be kind of a stretch with the argument there, but I thought both this story and the previous section of readings we covered deal with the British oppression, the British colonization of other people that the British saw as inferior. And so I thought it would be great to bring these two stories, or this story and this other set of readings, together. And that would enable me to talk about the cultural context sections of your paper that you'll have to write for your papers. You can find primary sources anywhere, including the library and Google Books, and we'll talk about that more in lesson 5. But this Norton anthology is great because it has these sections that give cultural context, such as the slave trade and literature of abolition section. And those sections are clearly demarcated in the textbook. And so you can pull from any of them. I'm not assigning all of them, but when you're trying to figure out what argument to make and what cultural context, what primary sources to use, you can pull from any of those cultural context sections in the textbook, and they're clearly demarcated in the table of contents the way the abolitionist one is. So hopefully that makes sense. Hopefully this thesis statement makes sense, and the idea of doing a cultural context section makes sense. Again, we'll talk about it more in lesson 5. But if you have any questions, please email me. I'd love to talk to you about it. So that's it. That's my reading of Edgeworth. I think it's a great story. I'm excited to read what you come up with in your threads and thesis, because there's a lot more to this story we haven't unpacked. And again, the idea is I give one example, I kind of model for you, give you one prominent take on the reading, and then you come up with more in the creativity part of the class. So I'm really looking forward to reading those. I hope you enjoyed this first lecture. Again, it's easily the longest lecture. The length of this Edgeworth section is about the length the sections will usually be. And so the overall 4-part lecture will be closer to an hour or 90 minutes rather than over 2 hours like it was today. So thank you. Thank you for your patience. I hope you enjoyed these. I hope they're helpful. I really look forward to working with you this quarter. Take care.